Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and on today's Yours to Make tutorial presented by Dickies, we are making this beautiful cherry wood with epoxy coffee table. If you want to learn how to do it, keep on watching. Let's get started. Now we have a few new tools in the shop today. This, of course, is a chainsaw, 18-inch bar size with about a 45cc motor, which is a good mid-sized chainsaw. However, this is a mini sawmill from Greenberg, and all we have to do is connect it to our chainsaw, and we're able to cut certain depths of slabs very easily and very DIY friendly. So let's get to it.
The system is actually quite easy to assemble as well as install the chainsaw itself into the system. All I have to do is slide it in, secure the chainsaw evenly with a couple bolts on the bottom side of the rig, and there you go. Now, the stump.
Now this is our beautiful cherry wood stump. Yes, I know, it's not much to look at now, but I have envisioned something beautiful out of this. I think it's all gonna work out in the end.
Now, if you haven't used a chainsaw before, make sure you do your due diligence and know how to use it properly before you try something like this out. Just note to self. Specifically with this rig, it's really nice because all you have to do is set the height and the depth that you want and then proceed to starting the chainsaw, and you're rock and rolling really quickly. The chain that comes with this chainsaw is actually a very nice high quality chain. However, you should be using a ripping chain if you do want to have larger, more extensive cutting than this. The ripping blade just makes the process go faster, which makes life easier. Now that we have our slab, I then bring it into my workbench and set it onto some bench cookies just to try and level it out, or at least as level as it can get at this point. Specifically, the bark itself should be removed at this point because of the fact that it's not going to be staying on there throughout this process, and it could be a danger once we start planing down this slab.
Now this is our slab flattening mill by Woodpeckers. Now specifically, it's a perfect way to flatten large scale slabs quickly and easily, especially when you have this size of a router with that size of a bit. So let's get to flattening.
This router sled system, which I purchased on Amazon, it's not a cheap system. However, it's pretty amazing and it makes quick work of a process like this, as well as it being very accurate. I'm using a router with a 1/4 inch shank, and the flattening bit is actually 2 inches wide, which means that I can take extremely large passes for the most part, which makes quick work of removing this much amount of material. Once I have one side leveled out, I then proceed to flipping it over and placing it on the bottom side. Now, specifically, both sides need to be leveled out as much as possible. They don't have to be perfect, but I do want to get pretty close to a nice flat slab. Now, just a quick heads up, I definitely was not the most accurate with my chainsaw milling system. I did dig a bit deep in the middle, which unfortunately made this slab much thinner than it needed to be. However, in the long run, it actually did save me money because of the fact that I didn't have to use as much epoxy as I originally anticipated, which is nice.
Now, as you can see, that was quite a bit of work just to flatten out this slab, and it was significant just because of how rough it was. However, at this point, I'm gonna just slightly go over the entire surface with 80 grit sandpaper just to make sure we have as flattened surface as possible before we start epoxy.
The sander I'm using is a Bosch sander, and I absolutely love it. Not only does it have an attachment where it connects to my shop vac, so there's very little dust that's actually created when I'm sanding, but it also has a turbo mode, which makes the sanding process much quicker because it's not your standard orbital sanding process. It makes quick work of a lot of sanding needed if you have a lot of rough sanding to do. At this point, we need to make our form for our epoxy pour. Now specifically, I always use a melamine just because it's a cheap material, as well as you can cut it in a copious amounts of ways. Now we can't pour the epoxy directly on the melamine because it will stick to it, which is why I'm spraying contact adhesive spray first and then applying a plastic barrier in order to easily remove the epoxy from the form after it dries. Now this is actually a technique that I just learned recently and I wanted to try it out for the first time. There's a couple unique things about it because it's literally just a garbage bag that I used, so it made it very easy to apply one large sheet versus a bunch of small pieces of tape. However, it was hard to get some of those bubbles out and therefore I didn't get a perfectly smooth finish on the bottom side due to that, so keep that in mind if you do try this yourself.
As you can see, mishaps do happen in shops sometimes, and I was a bit careless at the moment there. However, luckily we are pouring this in a large vat of epoxy, so that'll take care of the adhesion process. Note to self.
At this point, you can use that same melamine paneling in order to fabricate the walls of your form. However, I did have some plastic L trim lying around because I actually used it for a concrete form, and I know the epoxy will not stick to this, which just makes the installation process just a little bit easier because of the fact that I don't have to do any type of taping on all of my side walls if they're melamine. I pre-drilled a few holes approximately 6 inches apart, but the key aspect here, especially with formwork, is making sure you apply silicone. Yes, silicone is a game changer when trying to do an assembly like this because epoxy does not like silicone, and it makes it very difficult for epoxy to try and run out of forms like this. Trust me, I've had issues, and it has not been pretty. I attach the larger forms to the sides of the melamine, and then on the ends I actually attach it to the very top of the melamine. Just again, make sure you apply a nice heavy coat of silicone prior to installing your formwork. I also highly suggest applying some silicone to the inside of your form as well as on the edges, and tape the edges properly in order to ensure no leakage whatsoever. As for epoxy on this project, we are using Total Boat resin, and there are a few different types of resin that we're going to be using on this project. The first one is going to be actually a slow hardener, and I know it says slow hardener, but inevitably it's actually the faster drying version of the thick set epoxy. Now once we mix it up, I then use some Tap Plastics pigment in order to completely turn this epoxy jet black. Now this is an opaque pigment, which is perfect because it's going to give us a really nice contrast between the epoxy versus the light wood. And just like any good epoxy, make sure that you mix appropriately for at least 2 to 3 minutes prior to applying it to the surface. Now we're specifically applying this to the edges of the wood as well as some of those larger crack areas on top because we want to seal off those areas as much as possible. I let it dry for approximately an hour and then I proceed to mixing the other epoxy.
98, 99, 100. Whew. Okay, so since we actually did crack this slab, I'm putting a little bit of weight on a couple of these pieces just so I know for certain they're going to stay in position, especially during the curing process. So note to self, put some tape on there at the bottom so they don't stick to the slab afterwards.
I mixed the thick set epoxy in a large bucket because of the fact that this is actually a very large amount. Now specifically, we're going to be doing the same process. We're going to be mixing first, then applying our pigment and ensuring that we have proper mix throughout the entire batch. I really don't have an accurate amount of a pigment that I use for this gallon kit, but just know the fact that I had at least 5 spoonfuls of the opaque pigment product, which when mixed thoroughly gives us a very dense black look. Something about pouring epoxy on a wood slab just is so inviting and enticing, at least in my opinion, and this is definitely one of those projects. As for pouring, it's a bit easy and self-explanatory. I'm basically pouring into both ends and hopefully it all mixes together properly in the middle. In all honesty, I probably could have just poured this directly on top of the slab, but where's the fun in that? Actually, that does kind of sound fun. I might need to do that in the next one. Once fully poured, I do wipe off some of the excess epoxy on the wood. However, it's not needed, especially with the fact that we need to still flatten this. So let's get to flattening. Now, specifically, we waited over 48 hours for this to fully cure because it's thick set epoxy and it cures much slower than regular epoxy due to the fact that if you poured this with regular epoxy, it would actually get to the point where it potentially starts smoking and bubbling due to the heat. Yes, this is a chemical reaction and therefore heat can be caused, especially if you use too much at once, so keep that in mind. Now, even though we have a plastic barrier below, it might take a bit of time just to pry it up slightly. It doesn't take that much effort, but a hammer or two will take care of the vast majority of all your needs. At this point in time, we then proceed to routering. Yes, back to flattening with our milling router sled. Now, this specifically is a lot easier this time because the board is obviously much flatter. However, it still does take 2 to 3 passes on both sides before I get it to an acceptable flatness, or at least my acceptable flatness. Now, a router sled system is actually extremely valuable and easy to use if you know what you're doing, and if you do want a cheap version, I did do a video on my channel on how to make a $20 version, so if you do want to check that out and you are interested, please do so. Once I have the slab fully flattened, I then actually take my router with a V-shaped routing bit and go over all of the sides. This just gives the edge a bit more character and provides a more professional look and feel to the tabletop itself. A very quick, easy process to do if you're interested. At this point, we are ready to start sanding, and this is a bit of a pain. Unless you're crazy like me and you love sanding, but inevitably this is an hour or two process just sanding the bottom, sides, and top of this tabletop. Now, it takes an extensive amount of sanding to do because we have epoxy, and the fact of the matter is you need a very nice, clean, even surface in order to have a proper finish in the long run. I go from 100 grit to 150 to 200 grit sandpaper on this entire slab. Now, specifically, if I wasn't doing a flood coat, I'd actually have to go even higher on the epoxy in order to make sure you don't see swirl marks. But for this project, we are doing a flood coat for our final finish, which does make the sanding process a little bit easier, luckily. As for a finishing touch on the edges, I then take a soft sanding block with 350 grit sandpaper and sand those edges smooth, as well as the corners, specifically the corners because they do feel a little sharp at this point and we want them perfectly smooth to the touch. Now, if you hadn't noticed, we actually had a bit of epoxy suckage right in this corner because of the fact that that wood was so dry. It actually sucked up the moisture of the epoxy, and therefore while the epoxy was drying, it was also being sucked into it, but not a problem because we're going to be doing a flood coat. I wipe down all the surfaces with mineral spirits and a clean lint-free cloth. After that is dry, I then take a tack cloth and go over the entire surface. That just gets up all the miscellaneous particles that the mineral spirits couldn't pick up. This is a very important step, especially with the fact that we're going to be pouring a flood coat of epoxy on top of this. And any miscellaneous particles that are not picked up will float within our epoxy. Now, we could use the slow cure epoxy that we used previously, but I would suggest using the Halcon clear epoxy because of the fact that you're easily able to apply it to the back side of the surface, spread it on. Within an hour, it's fully dried and ready for a second coat if you want it. Now, specifically, I do 2 coats on the backside, and I'm just doing this because the backside really doesn't need a full flood coat like the top. Once the backside is dry, I then proceed to flipping it over, and we are now ready for our flood coat. Now, I do go over it one last time with that tack cloth just to ensure we get up all the miscellaneous particles that we possibly can. However, at this point, we're going to be using our tabletop epoxy from Total Boat. Now, specifically, same exact product, but this is going to be a 1-to-1, so it actually cures faster than our slow cure, which was a 2-to-1 product. For a table of this size, I mixed up approximately 18 ounces of epoxy, which in all honesty was the perfect amount for this table. I'm using a flat plastic spreader just to evenly distribute the epoxy over the top, as well as a clean foam brush to get all the edges. And the nice thing about the edges is the fact that most of it is epoxy, and therefore with the edges a small amount of wet epoxy will really bring out the luster of the hardened black epoxy table. As the epoxy naturally cures and sets, you're gonna have some air bubbles, and the best thing to remove air bubbles is a torch because it makes quick work of popping all those little bubbles, and it's just satisfying. I personally waited 24 hours to let the tabletop fully cure and then proceed to installing the legs. These are very standard generic hairpin legs I picked up on Amazon, but they look great and the simplicity I feel is perfect for this type of table. I measure out 2 inches on both sides to center all the legs properly in position, and then mark my fastening locations. Now you do want to be very careful when you're drilling here because the last thing you want is to drill straight through your tabletop. I do make a mark on my drill in order to accommodate the fact that I know for certain I'm not going too deep if I hit that little piece of tape at the very bottom. Once the holes are pre-drilled, I then proceed to installing my fasteners, and I always choose black fasteners if possible because it just looks better with a black table, or at least in this case, black table legs.
Now, a fun part to all my working pieces is that I like to brand them with a perfect little BYOT emblem. Now, this brand is actually from Gearhart Industries. Perfect high quality brand that all you have to do is plug in and you're cooking. This is actually cooking at 250 degrees, so plenty hot. Let's burn some wood.
In all honesty, I would highly suggest branding prior to applying finish, but in this case, I did forget. But you gotta brand it still, right? However, with that complete, guess what? We are done. I love a project like this because it really pushes you to learn new skills as well as develop the way that you can incorporate different types of materials on the same project. With the epoxy versus the wood and the steel legs, I think this table really does come together beautifully in a really nice dramatic way. Huge thank you to Dickies for allowing me to be a part of this project because of the fact that this wouldn't have happened without them, so thank you so much. And as you can see, this is one truly beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.